Andrew Hunt and other EMA board members and staff who are here today. Can I acknowledge a number of members of Parliament, past and present, who are in the room, and can I acknowledge our EMA members who I think in this calendar year, this is the fastest registration and closeout event we have had so far, which I think is testament to today's subject and to today's speaker, and we'll move on to that straight away. Our guest speaker today is Christopher Luxon, the leader of the opposition National Party, and great to have you here, Christopher. We've had the benefit of knowing each other for quite some time in previous guises and now in our respective roles, so it's great to have you here. I don't think that we have been facing such challenging times in my living memory for New Zealand. Many of those things are issues in our own country, and we're also surrounded by a set of very volatile issues internationally which impact our members every day. And as recently as this morning, in conversations with members of ours about the struggles that they're having with global supply chain issues, with finding workers here, with some of the disparities coming out of our education system and the need for us to help them with things like basic literacy and numeracy for school leavers. These are indeed difficult times. We have a budget that this government will deliver later this month, and I know that Christopher is going to talk today about the National Party's view of that exercise and some of the challenges that we face. So please join me in welcoming Christopher Luxon.
Well, kia ora tātou, no mai, haere mai, a welcome and a big thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. Can I just say a special thank you for the EMA Forum series for hosting us here this afternoon. And can I just say thank you to Andrew Hunt and Brett O'Reilly and Alan McDonald for all the work that you do here at the EMA with your team in educating and advocating for business. I do want to acknowledge my very good friend and Nationals Deputy and Finance Spokesperson Nicola Willis. Nicola, I think, is doing a fantastic job of holding Grant Robertson to account for this cost of living crisis and his addiction to spending that frankly isn't delivering any results. And so well done, Nicola. Thank you for being here. And can I also acknowledge my other colleagues from our caucus team that are here today too. Judith Collins, Shane Retty, Paul Goldsmith, Simeon Brown, Michael Woodhouse, Scott Simpson, Melissa Lee and Simon Watts. Thanks for being here. Now on the 19th of May, we'll get to see what Labor plans to do with around $6 billion a year in new operating spending, plus a few billion more in capital. And that is by far and away the biggest spending budget New Zealand has ever seen in its history. And on Budget Day, we'll also get to see Treasury's view of what the economy will look like in the coming years. And it's that part that I want to focus on today. How can we kickstart and enlarge our economic engine? How we can back business and unleash enterprise to lift incomes, to help Kiwis get ahead, and to give people more choices in the way they get to live their lives. Now, one of the best parts of my job is talking with Kiwis up and down this great country of ours about their hopes and their aspirations. And I can tell you we're a diverse lot and we should be very, very proud of that. But wherever I go, most Kiwis have the same attitude. We're aspirational about our lives and we're aspirational about this great country of ours. We love a challenge and we're willing to work hard to build a better life for ourselves and a better future for our children. And I want New Zealand to realise its maximum potential and to help build a society where every Kiwi can flourish. And when I talk to Kiwis, I feel that same energy, because we want a country where if you work hard, you can get ahead and you can earn enough to not just look after your family today, but to create choices for your future. A country where our kids can go overseas, but they choose to come back because they believe this is the place where opportunity exists. Where they can buy a home with a few years of hard work and saving. And a country with amazing health and education services that work for everyone. A government that isn't just spin, but actually delivers for people. And unfortunately, Labor has no plan for the economy except to spend more money and to rely on the Reserve Bank to run loose monetary policy. And this economic mismanagement has contributed to the highest inflation in over 30 years. And as a result of that, Kiwis are going backwards fast. Their money doesn't buy as much as it did, and they're worse off than they were 12 months ago. It's Kiwis like the young family I met in Otaki who put everything into buying their first home just 18 months ago, but now face rapidly rising interest rates that will see their yearly mortgage costs go up by more than $6,000. Or it's the young couple who came up to me on Anzac Day in Botany, a teacher and a nurse, who can't save for a deposit for a house in the area they work in because their rent and living costs are going up. And they actually are starting to think that they may be able to build a better future for themselves in Australia. Facing a cost of living crisis has meant that a squeezed middle has emerged. But rather than addressing the drivers of the cost of living crisis, including the government's own policies, I think Labour's approach is just to throw cash at every problem. They're treating the symptoms, not the causes. And on Budget Day, Grant Robertson has to take responsibility for presenting a credible plan to combat inflation, to reduce costs, to remove bottlenecks from the economy, and to ensure that we're getting value for taxpayers' money. And I think he could start by adopting National's 4-point inflation fighting plan. 1, stop adding costs to businesses that get passed on to the rest of us, as we've seen with new taxes on rental properties. Stop the jobs tax and the union-mandated industry-wide employment agreements. 2, remove the bottlenecks in the economy that are constraining growth. Fix immigration settings that are worsening our skills shortages. 3, review existing spending and revisit plans to go on the biggest budget spend up in history. It's very hard to justify record new annual spending of $6 billion in an overheated economy. 4, prioritise tax relief for workers, because inflation has pushed people into higher tax brackets when Kiwis need more of that cash in their own pockets. National, as you well know, would inflation adjust tax brackets so that Kiwis keep more of what they earn. And that would mean an extra $1,600 more a year for a household on an average income. Those people doing it tough in the squeezed middle. Now, a longer-term priority is to make sure we don't get into this mess again by returning the Reserve Bank to a single mandate of price stability. With the budget coming up, the government will be gearing up to proudly announce where it plans to spend billions of taxpayers' dollars. But the truth is, Labor has been on an unprecedented spending spree that has achieved very little. Spending is up a staggering 68%. But Kiwis are not seeing a 68% improvement in outcomes. Far from it. We're spending $5 billion more on education, but have seen worse attendance and academic achievement outcomes. We spent $1.9 billion on mental health, but there was no improvement in the access to mental health services. $1.7 billion in law and order, but violent crime is up, ram raids and shootings are increasing, and gang membership has exploded. $6.8 billion more a year on benefits, despite record job vacancies and labour shortages. And the thing is, this is not the government's money, this is taxpayers' money. The government should be treating it as carefully as Kiwi households and businesses do their own. And here's a good example. Because taxpayers are spending $100 million subsidising a slow train from Hamilton to Auckland that hardly gets any passengers. And it's being subsidised to the tune of $280 per person per journey. And that results in more carbon emissions and longer journey times than if you just jumped in your car and drove the distance yourself. It frankly would be cheaper to put everyone into a taxi. Now, they'll say $100 million is a relatively small portion of total government spending, which it is. But frankly, not worrying about the effectiveness of $100 million spend speaks to an alarming culture of poor fiscal discipline. We want a government that cares about how every single dollar is spent, because every single dollar the government spends is ultimately a dollar from your pocket, the taxpayer. And that's what Nicola Willis will do as our Finance Minister. And the government I lead will focus relentlessly on results, delivering better outcomes for each dollar spent. And that means bringing back targets and accountability, which this government has dispensed with. We'll celebrate the successes, but we'll also hold ourselves to account when things don't work. It also means being pragmatic enough to know when more Wellington bureaucracy is not the solution, because the best solutions often come from community organisations and businesses, and in that case, government's role is to enable, not to dominate, and not to centralise. And it means investing in what works and constantly questioning whether taxpayers are benefiting. And that's the criteria we'll use to assess the record new spending in this budget. Not just the dollars, but what Kiwis are actually going to get for it. By doing more with each dollar, we can lower the tax burden, we can pay down debt, and we can unleash economic opportunity for everyone while delivering better public services. And while government spending gets a lot of attention at budget time, there's often little focus on the wider economics criteria that drive prosperity in New Zealand. And it's those settings that I want to focus on in my remarks today. National talks a lot about business and we talk a lot about the economy, but not for its own sake. We want a strong economy because that is how we drive prosperity for all Kiwis. We want a strong economy because that is how we lift wages, grow jobs and create choices for families. We want a strong economy because with that comes incomes growing faster than prices. That's how Kiwis get ahead, and that's how we as a country can invest in the things that matter to all of us, like delivering world-class healthcare, education that works for everyone, a police force that keeps our communities safe, and protecting our environment. Labor's economic approach isn't working because they believe that government, and in particular, government spending drives prosperity. And I utterly reject that view. It's the reason Labor haven't been focused on microeconomic reforms much needed to grow our economy. National knows that our future will be built on the hard work of Kiwis and businesses and communities up and down this great country. So we're focused on the policies to support these Kiwis and to make it easier to have a go, easier to invest, easier to innovate, easier to employ, and easier to take a punt. Policies that will grow the pie for all of us. So today, I want to outline a bit more about how we can kickstart and enlarge the engine room of our economy to drive more prosperity for all of us. I'm talking about the broader economic approach and framework that National will implement to deliver strong, sustainable growth over the rest of this decade and beyond. Now, there's not one big bang solution to this challenge, so I'm not going to announce a big policy today and claim it will be transformational. Instead, National's approach is to relentlessly target the big drivers of our economic engine: education and skills, infrastructure, technology, the business environment, and our connections to the world. These are the factors that have worked worldwide to drive prosperity, and now as our economy falters, we need to look to them to supercharge our growth story going forward. So first, we need to ensure we have the skills needed for growth. A great education is essential for creating opportunity, and it gives young people choices and businesses access to the talent that they need. So when we spend $5 billion more a year on education, but see no improvement in achievement, and 40% of our children don't even attend school regularly, that's not just a social failure, it's a future economic crisis. And in maths and reading and science, our kids are now falling behind other countries. And these are the basics that no child in New Zealand should struggle with. And for some, the system works fine. They turn up at school, they engage with great teachers, they go home to attentive parents who help them to read and write. But for far too many, we just have no idea. We're letting too many children fall through the cracks because we're not even paying attention. We need to make better use of information to drive better results, improving our understanding of how well each child is progressing so that we can intervene where needed. We need to know which kids are not showing up for class and why. We need to regularly assess every child's progress and report back to parents so that they understand if their kid needs extra help, they can get it. We need to know which schools are making a difference so others can learn from them. And if a child can't read or add as well as their peers, we need to know that, because otherwise they're going to spend the next 5 years sitting at the back of the classroom, feeling excluded and becoming disillusioned with education. And as well as building talent through education, we can support that talent by enhancing our workforce through immigration. And that doesn't just mean opening up the doors to anyone and everyone, but it does mean competing with the rest of the world to attract the best and brightest to New Zealand. Unlike Labour, the National Party doesn't see immigration as a zero-sum game. An ambitious migrant coming here to work doesn't mean fewer jobs or lower wages for Kiwis. In fact, it means more opportunities and better outcomes as it grows the pie. Talent builds talent, and we need more of it. Now, we all know New Zealand has an infrastructure deficit that is holding back growth and productivity. And the previous National-led government made a good start on addressing it. Ultra-fast broadband was rolled out on time and under budget thanks to National. We built Waterview and the Waikato Expressway. Transmission Gully was talked about for 50 years. National funded it and started it. And one of the first things that Labour did upon coming to office was to cancel a series of really important roading projects underway under National, only to resurrect them in 2020 and then to go cancel a few of them right again after the election. Under Labour, the delivery of infrastructure is stagnating. National gets things done. I'm going to have a lot more to say about infrastructure in the coming year, but I want to signal a few high-level things today. The government I lead will be visionary and bold when it comes to planning ahead, because New Zealand has generally taken a just-in-time approach to infrastructure. We tend to build things when we think we need them, and that usually means way too late. Think of the City Rail link, which National funded in 2013. The government I lead will have an intense focus on delivering the infrastructure needed for new housing. And that's why I've asked Chris Bishop to have both the infrastructure and housing portfolios, because we don't want a lack of transport links or pipes to be an impediment to going up in our cities and going out at the edge of them. We're going to partner with local government to facilitate the new housing that we so desperately need. And we're also going to innovate more on the financing of infrastructure. We need to get serious about tapping into different sources of funding, ensuring borrowing is used for genuine investments, exploring new pricing mechanisms, accessing third-party finance to share risk and to free up capital. Everything should be on the table in order to get things done. And we need regulation that's not a barrier. We desperately need to get on with replacing the RMA and delivering simple rules that protect what should be protected without bogging progress down in endless back and forth between lawyers and bureaucrats. And unfortunately, the government's current approach runs a real risk of making things worse. Because here's the facts. Developers are spending $1.3 billion on consenting alone each year. And the time it takes to get a consent has more than doubled in the last decade. We're holding ourselves back with red tape just when we need to be accelerating. But skills and infrastructure aren't enough by themselves. And you can have skilled workers with fast commutes, but you also need to give them the tools to become more productive. Kiwis are rightly proud of our making do. The number 8 wire mentality has worked for us for a long time. But we are now in a period of fundamental change, and the make do attitude needs an update. Because the impact of digital disruption and new technologies is uncertain, but we already know that the way we live and the way that we work is now very different to what it was yesterday. And more change is coming. New and emerging technologies will transform our lives at work, at school and at home at an unprecedented pace, and coalescing with the changing shape of our workforce and our communities to create both opportunities and also challenges for our country as we go forward. And I do want to acknowledge the great work from my colleague Judith Collins, who is doing everything to develop the policies to support the tech sector to grow even further. The message I want to send to New Zealand's best and brightest minds, both here and overseas, is that technology and innovation will be championed by a national government. And this just isn't about digital tech like cloud computing. I mean technology and capital in its broadest sense, our ability to invest in new plant, machinery, processes and software. Tools that may require a bit of upfront investment, but then set the stage for Kiwis to create much more value down the track. And we have some amazing success stories like Xero and Rocket Lab, but more generally, slow technology adoption and low capital intensity is one of the reasons why if you take a Kiwi and you go plonk them down in Sydney or Singapore, the value they can create instantly increases. So we need to remove barriers preventing our small businesses from accessing capital and growing into large ones. And that also means ensuring New Zealand is the kind of economy that welcomes investment and has more businesses competing on the world stage. Particularly investment that comes with expertise attached. Investment into businesses with the goal of making them much bigger, much faster. Which I guess brings us to the broader business environment. because we have to make it easier to build a business in this country. Kiwis thrive when we have a dynamic, competitive economy, and it's the government's job to get the settings right so that those businesses can step up and achieve that. And that means a predictable and a consistent regulatory environment. But the more and more businesses I speak to are bringing up constantly changing regulation as a big barrier to growth and investment. And a business owner I recently spoke to, he told me he'd turned down a big export contract because it would mean hiring more staff and investing in new plant. And it frankly wasn't worth it because of the constantly changing rules and the red tape that he was encountering. New regulations should be justified on outcomes, not politics, ideology and spin. Old regulations should be constantly retested. If they're no longer fit for purpose, they should be amended or repealed. Now, it's easy to say, but it's hard work, but it matters. Because no single regulation will kill a business, but the total cost of dozens of outdated rules and unresponsive systems can be substantial. And it drives up prices across our economy. And our regulatory environment needs to reflect this. Small businesses need room to be agile. Growth should be encouraged, not punished. Innovation and competition should be welcomed, not shunned. And removing the most costly rules needs to become part of the standard operating procedure for any government. And some of the most obvious, like Labour's misnamed fair pay agreements, can be unwound relatively quickly. But ministers need to think twice before introducing counterproductive rules like the CCCFA lending crackdown that has made it much harder for people to borrow for a home, or for the removal of 90-day trials, which made it much riskier to take a punt on someone new. But we also need to make it far easier for businesses to employ skilled migrants without jumping through endless paperwork to sponsor visas. And regardless of the content of the rules, businesses need certainty and speed when they are applied. As I said earlier, the delay in getting rulings on consents is adding millions to the cost of development here in New Zealand. And I've had employers tell me horror stories about employment cases that take literally years to work through their way through the courts. And meanwhile, constant change and a lack of predictability, such as the government's surprise introduction of taxes on housing, it all undermines confidence and it has a chilling effect. And with inflation already running at a 30-year high, higher than many of our trading partners, it shouldn't be controversial to call for the government to stop adding costs onto businesses, which will ultimately be passed on to customers. Finally, to rebuild our economy, we need to rebuild our connections with the world, because New Zealand has a proud history of looking outward and stepping out onto the world stage, and we need to reclaim that, not just close ourselves away here. Some might think that global events are moving in the other direction, that countries are retreating and closing themselves off. And yes, war and populism and protectionism have made a very unwelcome return. But New Zealand must and it can buck this trend. As a small, isolated economy, we need to remain open for business. Australia, for example, now has a trade deal with India. And it's not perfect, but it's much more than what we have. And they negotiated it through the COVID times. We must get back out there into the world in force and open our markets up that will help Kiwi firms grow and compete. And we also need to be open to investment, because as a small, isolated economy, you'd think we'd be doing whatever it takes to attract investment into our country. But instead, we have the second most restrictive regime for foreign investment in the entire OECD. And we need to attract genuine, growth-enhancing investment to our shores that makes New Zealand firms stronger and actually helps New Zealand workers work smarter and therefore earn higher wages. And New Zealand has a chance now to reconnect with the world better than we did before the pandemic on trade, investment and migration. And opening up the world supports competition, faster technology adoption, deeper capital markets and more access to international know-how. It's a really good thing, because there's a global market out there of almost 8 billion people, and we'd be foolish not to embrace it. So our plan is to focus on each of these 5 levers of prosperity: education and skills, infrastructure, technology, the business environment, and our connections to the world. That's the pathway to unleashing enterprise. That's the pathway to delivering a stronger economy and to lift incomes. and to achieving real growth where wages outpace the cost of living and Kiwis can actually get ahead. A new approach, a new framework is critical right now. Because there's a squeezed middle watching the cost of everything skyrocket while this government seems to have forgotten about them entirely. But I have to tell you, I'm feeling positive and aspirational for New Zealand. I believe that with a fresh approach from a new government, we can realise New Zealand's massive potential. We have great talent in this country and we have a great natural environment. And with the right approach, I'm confident New Zealand can meet at the challenges of the 21st century and we can overcome them. It's what we need so that people like that family I spoke to in Otaki can earn enough to cover their rising mortgage costs. It's what we need so that young couple from Botany can pay their rent and actually put aside some savings for their first home. It's what we need so a generation of young Kiwis feel that they can make their futures here in New Zealand. They can start a business, raise a family, make a contribution in the community. So I'm optimistic about New Zealand, a growing economy where entrepreneurship and innovation delivers great jobs and higher incomes for all Kiwis. A relentless focus on outcomes in health, in education and infrastructure, rather than spending more and getting less for it. A government that works with business and works with the community, rather than trying to freeze them out and trying to do it all on its own. Because in an uncertain and difficult world, I want you to know that National is ready to take on the serious job of delivering for all New Zealanders. And thank you very much for listening for me today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Christopher. We're going to do things slightly differently today because Christopher's got some media obligations. So he's going to do a bit of
opening up to our connections to the world, and investing in technology. Those are the 5 big things that we've got to do. Well, I think it's really important to have a framework, an economic framework, which is what's been missing from this government. What we're getting is tactics, and actually we need to be able to start the work, and we've already started it with our National Caucus, of actually introducing policy that as we go forward in the next 18 months, you'll see that delivered and start to infill that framework that we've got. I'm telling you right now, what the New Zealanders are asking for is how do you fundamentally solve an inflation crisis and a cost of living crisis? And you've got to take a step back and say these are the foundations of a good economy. When you look at other small advanced economies all around the world and you ask why do they have higher levels of wealth in New Zealand, it's because of those 5 big factors and foundations that we have in place in their economy, and that's what we want to be able to do. Yeah, well, look, I mean, the Prime Minister campaigned and said that as long as she was Prime Minister, she would not introduce a wealth tax. And what we've seen today is the signalling, I think, of a U-turn. I think the other thing is very obvious to us. When you have a 68% increase in government spending, you spend $52 billion more this year than you did in 2017. The only answer ultimately is to tax. And so that's why I am really concerned about where the Prime Minister's going with it, and she needs to front and say what's in and what's out. Well, they can't be. Since this government's come to power, it's introduced a whole bunch of taxes over the course of this parliament. You think about the changes that happened to the Bright Line test, you think about the changes that happened with interest deductibility, you think about the proposal with the new jobs tax, 2.8% for workers and for employers. You think about the, what's very poorly named fair pay agreements. Those are all big taxes and big disincentives for government, for employers. Well, what I can tell you is that $12 billion of the COVID fund was not actually spent on COVID stuff. And we would have supported investing in COVID, but we're now past COVID, and to be spending $52 billion more and contemplating another $6 billion a year for the next 4 years through this budget is a time for us, and the OECD's been saying it, the Reserve Bank Governor's been saying it, and we've been calling at it from when I became the leader to say, watch the spending.
I'm happy to break those numbers down for you, Simon. It was $76 billion in 2017. It's risen this year to $128 billion. If we think about 2021 and 2020, which many people will remember as pandemic years, the spending then was $108, $109 billion. So there's no sign of the spending abating as the pandemic abates. In fact, next year, Grant Robertson is predicting spending of $120 billion, so well above levels in 2017.
Well, what I've got to say to you is that what we're saying is that there is such a big increase in existing spending that you need to be able to go through that line by line and actually question, are we getting value for it? You also need to look at the new spending that's coming through and saying, look, we actually should be thinking about whether that's appropriate in this environment and can it be justified. I can give you lots of examples. I can tell you, as I said in my speech, $100 million slow train, 10,000 more bureaucrats added into Wellington. We've got an extra, $1.9 billion being spent on mental health. We want that money spent, but we want the outcomes. And that's the big difference here. The government assumes a dollar being spent is equal to all dollars, and there is good spending and there is bad spending. A dollar can have a tenfold return or it can have no return. And so the fundamental thing here is that we need to be really clear on spending that delivers outcomes. And that's how we measure everything. Well, what I'd say to you is you like to belittle those examples, but the reality is that those examples speak to a very poor culture of fiscal discipline. I can tell you that Nicola Willis will be going through with all the ministers and all the portfolios saying, hey, listen, which programs work? Which programs don't work? Let's do more of what works, less of what doesn't work. There's lots of savings when you've got a $128 billion budget going down. And the second thing I'd say to you is the thing that has changed is the government has taken the focus away from really clear targets on our public services and their deliveries. So how do you spend $5 billion more on education and have 40% of our kids not going to school regularly? How do you spend $5 billion and actually end up with really poor maths, reading and science scores? How do you spend $5 billion and have 61% of our kids, I think, pass a very basic global reading test for 15-year-olds just in the last couple of months? Those aren't outcomes. And so we need to be focused on outcomes because, as I said, when you look at education, that's not just a social crisis, it's an economic crisis for New Zealand going forward. Sorry, mate. Well, what Grant Robertson needs to be focused on is really good fiscal discipline, and that's what we're asking for him. The OECD raised this several months ago. We raised it when I became the leader, and Nicola and I became, the leaders, and we've been talking about it for some time. Even, Adrian Orr, the Reserve Bank governor, said, hey, listen, don't leave it all to me to deal with higher interest rates. I need your help in terms of making sure you're doing everything fiscally that you can do to make this issue, less, and I don't have to take interest rates up as much. So that's the thing that Grant Robertson needs to really think about is how much spend money, but make sure you get outcomes and delivery for it. Don't just spend money and then get no outcomes. That's unacceptable. Do what New Zealanders are doing up and down this country, which is managing their own budgets in the same way. Yes, mate. We care deeply about the squeeze middle in New Zealand, and what I'm saying to you is, in the spirit of oppose and propose, we had a very simple idea that I think Grant Robertson should definitely include in his budget this time, which is to say that inflation has gone up almost 12% since this government came to power. He has collected an extra $12.5 billion of income tax off the back of that inflation increase. We think a very logical, very sensible, non-ideological, just a very common sense proposal is that in high inflation times you should be able to index the tax brackets so that you can lift it. And as a result, people don't get captured in higher taxes. What's perverse is that someone on the minimum wage working 43 hours a week gets taxed, the marginal tax rate is 30%. An average income earner here in New Zealand is getting taxed at a marginal rate of 33%. So it's a very simple thing. It's not meant to be deeply complicated or deeply ideological. It's just saying, hey, listen, we've got an existing system. Why don't we just lift the tax bands by the amount of inflation? And in doing so, that would help the squeeze middle. The people on $55,000 to $80,000 that fundamentally aren't getting support from the government. Well, what we're saying to you is when we go to the election, Nicola will deliver a fully costed tax and fiscal plan, and that's when our full tax policy will be there. But what we're talking about here is a very short-term, very practical, common sense idea that could be implemented in May as part of this budget in order to keep Kiwis with more cash in their pockets. And I can tell you, they will spend it much wiser, or they will save it much wiser than what Grant Robertson will do, spending it on wasteful spending and projects. Sorry, Amelia. Well, look, I mean, it is a really big challenge and it's a really big issue. What I'd say to you, and I want to reassure everybody, is that National is fully committed to our net carbon zero targets in 2050. Sea level rise and climate adaptation is a major project, and that's New Zealand's going to have to face up to. We want to see what the government's strategy and plan looks like, and we want to be able to be constructive about how we deal with that. There are complex issues in here about government getting the settings right, council thinking about the infrastructure, and private property owners as well. So I'm not going to predicate all of that today, but what I'm saying is, we understand that there is real investment needed around climate adaptation. We need to see the plan and then to be able to respond and be constructive about it. Those are complex issues. You've got government centrally that needs to do something, you've got local governments that need to be able to do something, and you've got private property owners. And so those are complex issues. They need to be worked through in the coming months. What my speech is about today is the fundamental economic drivers that when I look at other highly successful countries, I'm saying to you, those are the things that will make the difference and drive to higher wages and salary. I'm not to say that they're not important. We will have more to say around climate change and climate adaptation throughout the year. Well, what I'm saying to you is the way that we deal with that is we actually build an economy that can generate higher wages and incomes for all. When you have an education system, that means that actually people can't rely on that system to get from a set of bad circumstances to a set of better circumstances because it's failing them. That's not right. We need to be able to invest in that. When you have infrastructure, sorry? I disagree with you, Simon. The National Party has had consistent good increases to the minimum wage when it was in government the whole time it was in government. What we're saying to you today is that we need not a tactical response, we need to get the strategy right, and that's what my speech has been about, to say, look, There is a difference here. There is no strategy, economic strategy with the Labour Party, apart from spend, 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 and then tax, 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 and watch, it's coming. We've already seen it over the course of this Parliament. We've already seen the Prime Minister today start to foreshadow a wealth tax, even though she'd ruled it out when she was Prime Minister. So the answer is we need to get back to what are the fundamental pillars that actually drive this economy and actually can create higher wages and jobs for everyone. Well, look, I think, I'm thoroughly enjoying the job. There are things that I could have expressed better, as I've said openly, but fundamentally, I think we've got the plan and the team and the people going forward, and I think you're starting to see, as I travel the country, the public are on board. I think you've started to see we've got supporters and members, we've got great candidates emerging, so I'm feeling really encouraged. And you think about where we were just 5 months ago and where we sit today, I think we're in great shape with a great team. Climate change is really important, but what I'm saying to you is the 5 things that fundamentally power up our economy. If we want to protect our environment, if we want to be able to mitigate against climate, if we want to be able to do climate adaptation, a strong economy is what enables a really strong environmental response. A strong economy is what enables a really strong educational and healthcare response. Well, what I talked about today was infrastructure, for example, right? Climate adaptation is going to be a critical part of that infrastructure that we need to build and develop here in New Zealand. And so that's the example of what I'm saying. But at the moment, we've got a very ad hoc approach to infrastructure. Let's talk about it. For some reason, someone thought an $800 million spend on a walking and cycling bridge across Auckland was a brilliant idea. Someone else has actually thought a $30 billion light rail project is a brilliant idea. I can tell you there is better uses of that money that would have more impact on more people across this country. It's the prioritisation, it's the lack of a strategy, it's the lack of clarity about what is happening. Some of it's just dumb and some of it's just not good business cases, not good returns on that investment. I'm not going to talk about climate change, as I've said today. This is a focused speech today on the pillars of the economy and what I think we need to do to create more wealth and higher incomes, ultimately in this country through a strong economy. I'll have more to say around climate change. Suffice to say, that I care deeply about the fact that we need to be able to hit net zero in 2050. I've done a lot in that space in my past life. I will continue to champion it very strongly, and you'll see more of that in the coming months. Sorry? Yeah, look, when you look at productivity, when you look at productivity per person and you see much higher levels of income per person in Singapore or in places like Australia, when I've studied Denmark and I've been there and visited there, when I've gone to Switzerland, other small advanced economies, and you say, what's been the reason for why they can generate more wealth than New Zealand? How can they generate higher incomes than New Zealand for their people? A lot of it comes back to the quality of their education system, the quality of their infrastructure, their embracing of technology and research and development and innovation, certainly a pro-business environment, and also an environment that fundamentally stays connected to the world. No, it's fantastic. And Peter's a great friend of mine, and he's done a very good job building a business from New Zealand here. But he relies on really well-educated rocket scientists. He relies on good infrastructure to get his rockets out to the Mahia Peninsula. He relies on really good a business environment that encourages them to stay here rather than to go off overseas or somewhere else. Sorry? No, it's not. And I think when you get out of New Zealand, I just go see some other small advanced economies. And Amelia, you would have seen Singapore recently and seen some work that they've done around their infrastructure and how they manage that. It's a very different approach. And that's what I'm just saying is take a step back. Let's get strategic. Let's think about the big 5 drivers that drive economic wealth for New Zealand. That's how we raise incomes. I can tell you the cost of living here in New Zealand is amongst the highest of our trading partners that we deal with around the world. You were in Singapore recently, it's at 4%, Japan is at 1%, Australia's just hit 5%, we're at 7%. And so there's a real reason that we're actually saying, yes, they've got the same pandemic, they're dealing with the same war, they're dealing with the same global conditions, but the issue is about what we can control domestically, and a lot of that comes through spending and prioritisation. But what I can tell you is in places like Denmark, you have very good investments around technology and research and development and incubators and startup businesses. You have very good infrastructure. Think about the Øresund Bridge that connects Copenhagen to Malmö. That went from idea to finished product in a very short period of time. We've spent 25 years discussing an eastern busway that goes from Panmure to Botany. We've talked a lot about 20 years now of a central interceptor. We're doing infrastructure incredibly poorly relative to these other countries. And so my point is, hey, listen, we've got a great country here. We've got an awesome future ahead of us. We want to raise the tide for everybody in this country, but you've got to get back to the strategic underpinnings of the economy, and those are those 5 things. Hey, thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Thanks.